so much to all of you for joining us today for this webcast on establishing a second line of defense to sustain compliance. My name is Lindsay Holler. I'm a principal with Grant Thornton and focus in the privacy and data protection space. I've been with the firm for more than 16 years and work with my clients every day to help them, assess the new requirements, but also make sure that they have the support that they need to implement those requirements. So Eric, let me turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Lindsay. Eric Paulson, and pleasure to be here. Work with Lindsay day in and day out, so a lot of the same activities. I won't go into too much more detail there, but happy to be talking about privacy assurance today. Looking at those poll numbers, I think this is definitely something that would be very useful for a lot of organizations to look towards as they start building out their program.
Perfect. Well, I'll leave it to you. I'll be back near the close. In the meantime, just sharing with the audience, feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom and enjoy the session.
Thanks, everybody, or thanks, Camilla. So as she said, please add your questions into the Q&A. We'll try to answer some of those as we go, but we will leave some time at the end to address those. And Eric, I'll hand it over to you to kick things off.
Perfect. So first, this section, really just want to talk through privacy assurance and their role within privacy, the benefits and outcomes achieved through privacy assurance, and then really kind of just the beginning of establishing that privacy assurance program. So privacy is not the responsibility of one department or function within the company. It really requires cross-functional collaboration and buy-in from across the organization. So in order to sustain that compliance and manage risks, privacy teams should really look to this 3 lines of defense model to establish that second line of defense, which also known as privacy assurance. So what exactly is the role of privacy assurance? It's that function within privacy that is able to monitor regulations, those risks, set policies, guidelines, and really help that first line operations team follow those set guidelines that would put in place. It also is providing that third line internal audit with a framework to independently assess privacy compliance and risks that the organization is facing. So just as a quick example for everyone, a privacy assurance function would be needed to inform the business that they have to respond to EU data subject requests within that 1 month time period based off of regulation standards. So the business would be then responsible for designing that process in order to respond to those requests in a timely manner, and internal audits function would then be to kind of run that independent audit, making sure that the business did respond in a timely fashion. And if we look again, maybe for CCPA, business owners are required to do that within 45 days. So privacy assurance would then work with them and those responsible owners to set those guidelines as well. And where we see some organizations might be having some issues is where the same team is responsible for responding to both those GDPR and CCPA requests. And that's really where privacy assurance comes in and helps define those distinct guidelines based on the regulations and guiding those operations teams where those overlaps occur, but there might be some specific requirement changes. Additionally, breaking down these regulations will also just make it a little bit easier for internal audit to perform those checks and independent assessments on the back end. Another example might be the requirement for the consumers opt out of their sale of personal information mechanism. So the business is going to be determining how that process will work and who's responsible for performing each step in that process. And then again, internal audit would just be then independently assessing whether or not they've effectively processed those opt-outs. So really, as we look to the second line of defense, you can already start seeing that collaboration is extremely important. In addition to working with the first and third line, they're working with that legal team and being responsible for understanding compliance obligations, the risk appetite, and then, as mentioned, just helping those business first line owners understand their requirements and providing them with the opportunities and information to decide what's best for that business objective while supporting the overall customer experience. And then finally, just the second line of defense, helping establishing those roles through a privacy framework and that accountability for each process. So thinking about an additional benefit, it acts as kind of that training communication platform that really builds and promotes privacy by design through all of the privacy operations. and also just acts as that monitoring aspect and really helps internal audit also leverage the framework to perform those independent assessments. So a lot of different aspects go into this governance structure. So I guess the real next question is how do we really stand up that privacy assurance program? So as we look at the slide, it's reflecting our 3 pillars of support that we have identified. So in order to effectively monitor the compliance and risk, it's critical that we do set up that controls framework to establish roles and responsibilities. We have that compliance monitoring function, as well as the KRIs, or key risk indicators, to monitor and measure those privacy risks and obligations. So the first area that I just want to focus on is the privacy control framework. So this can really be leveraging any of those industry frameworks that exist out there. You have NIST, you have ISO. We've also seen organizations create their own custom framework just based off of their regulatory requirements. So a lot of flexibility in that area. But this framework will help the organization understand their compliance requirements, but also rationalize those requirements at the same time. It's going to define those objectives, thinking about any control matrix that align with the obligations and risk appetite. It's going to enable those business units to take responsibility and understand how to meet those objectives and be accountable for all the privacy controls that have been put in place. Most of the time we've seen business owners, they don't really want to be told to follow predefined steps or anything like that. So really giving them the control framework and letting them kind of define their own process that works best for them is the best way to go about building that framework out. And then each stakeholder is going to be kind of responsible in understanding their role within the compliance process. And then once you have that full framework built out, it's easy for the internal audit teams to leverage and evaluate how effective those controls are actually operating. The second pillar we have here is just compliance monitoring. So what steps does the company need to take to comply with privacy, the regulatory landscape, and continually evaluate their effectiveness of controls? So to support this, it's kind of a combination of both privacy and that first line business owner continually reviewing compliance requirements, objectives, and the corresponding processes and controls. Not only to make sure that they're still operating the way they once did, but that the control objective is also being met at the same time. And a lot of this can be done through compliance self-assessments. So control owners must kind of start that self-assessment process and making sure that they are meeting the objectives that they're responsible for. And privacy assurance will play that role of just providing that ongoing support, looking for new opportunities to mitigate risk or recommending some control enhancements to those business owners. And a critical part of that is, I mean, we all know that the regulatory landscape is constantly changing. There's emerging regulations or there's changing interpretations. So leveraging that control framework will also allow teams to identify where new gaps are popping up and provide the business with the requirements to meet new compliance objectives as they look forward and new regulations are coming out. And then the last pillar are going to be these key risk indicators. These are really the metrics that provide privacy with the opportunity to monitor compliance, continually assess risk, and evaluate maturity opportunities. Examples of KRIs that we normally see might be the number of data subject requests, the number of days outstanding, some inventory validations are the number of systems in a data inventory, et cetera. And these KRIs are really used to help the assurance teams make sure that those privacy activities, taking example DPIAs or data inventories, are being completed timely, while also understanding the trends for other compliance operations. So as a quick example, if the number of data subject requests has been trending upwards recently, the team should really look and assess what's the root cause of these requests. Did a new law go into effect recently? Like what's going on to cause that change? Does the organization have the bandwidth to respond to those requests timely? Is it going to need to consider automation? So the different aspects that kind of monitoring these KRIs can lead to finding different improvement opportunities that'll go unnoticed if they weren't in place. And then finally, really just looking at KRIs to support some program maturity. So for example, if you see an increasing number of controls in your framework, or the number of systems you have expanding from 100 to 500 systems, it's a lot of work, and it may kind of bolster the kind of process to getting those approvals for budget for different individuals, resources, technologies, things like that. So KRIs can actually provide a lot more than just simple statistics throughout the privacy assurance program. So looking at these, why do we need to start the privacy assurance program? Well, there are a number of outcomes that can come from this. First, I've mentioned a few times, are just those reinforced roles and responsibilities. Really need to have a defined difference between the business owners that are performing day-to-day operations, privacy assurance itself, and then the internal audit function. So as relatively new organizations setting up this program have really been challenged trying to get those business stakeholders to understand that they don't have a day-to-day job that doesn't include privacy anymore. Those business stakeholders have a day-to-day job plus focusing on what privacy aspects need to go as part of that. So that control framework will help those stakeholders understand the responsibilities and expectations as they each play their own specific role in sustaining that privacy program. Additionally, you can look for a platform for ongoing compliance monitoring. The way we see privacy compliance is that it's not an annual task, but an ongoing activity. It's something that's really proactive instead of reactive to prevent those escalating issues. And this is different from how we see internal audits being managed, which are meant to identify gaps at a certain point in time. But really that ongoing monitoring identifies those issues as they arise. It'll also strengthen those privacy operations. So with the proper support, those first line business owners aren't going to be left to just figure it out on their own, but they'll be provided those requirements and guidelines to support as needed, and as well as those ongoing self-assessment practices that I mentioned, really encouraging control owners to find new and better ways to meet their control objectives. Also, understanding those key objectives. So a lot of times we've seen business owners not understanding why some of these privacy controls exist or why they're performing them. So again, I think this framework really just bolsters the idea of why it needs to be put in place and supports the integration of privacy by design organically into the organization. And then lastly, just from a risk perspective, privacy assurance can really just reduce the risk from a legal and compliance standpoint. Knowingly, inherent risk is inevitable with any privacy regulation, but privacy assurance can really make sure that we reduce the overall residual risk that is in place. So as we described the controls framework, compliance monitoring, KRIs as pillars, to support that second line, the following components we're showing here, I think are really the building blocks. We've touched on each of them briefly, but just to emphasize the importance of each of them, I'll quickly summarize them once more. Regulatory requirements. This is really the laws and regulations that are applicable to your organization. Some of you may only have 1 or 2 regulations that are affecting, but if you're a global organization, there might be 10 or 15 different privacy regulations that you need to map your controls to. Developing those controls. So what needs to be in place to comply? Does more regulations mean more controls? Where can there be some overlap? And Lindsay will discuss that shortly in our next section. The roles and responsibilities, you can tell I keep mentioning this and it's such an important piece of privacy assurance, but there needs to be specific teams responsible for specific functions, and different business owners are going to be responsible for different activities. Risk mitigation, that's really just helping determine the risk criteria, establishing those guidelines, recommendations, and a roadmap that can be built into the framework. And then lastly, the self-monitoring. So making sure that you do perform those self-assessments and that control activities will create visibility in the privacy practices and adhering to those obligations that you've set forth. And then just throughout all these building blocks, making sure privacy is providing that ongoing support and really guide and oversee the first line of defense. And as needed, privacy assurance will also kind of help that third line of defense to leverage the controls framework and perform those independent audits. So given all of the overview and identifying privacy assurance and what it is, I'll pass it over to Lindsay, who will discuss kind of the establishment of privacy assurance and the underlying privacy framework.
Thank you, Eric. I think we can move forward to the next slide. So as you look to establish a privacy assurance function, one of the important things to start with is really building a framework. The framework will be the foundation and kind of the baseline for the program. As Eric mentioned, it'll help to make sure that individuals around the organization understand their roles, responsibilities, and will help give you a baseline to really manage and mitigate risks. So as we walk through these step by step, we'll talk about, how you determine, the right framework, ideas as we look to map the controls against regulatory requirements and define roles and responsibilities around the organization, as well as risks and eventually working to mitigate those risks. Can we move forward to the next slide? So the first step of establishing a privacy assurance is determining a framework approach. What we've seen a lot of companies do is leverage, kind of one of the leading frameworks, whether that's the NIST framework, ISO, ISACA, GAP, but taking, the control framework that those industry organizations have defined and then customizing that to fit your business and your organization. What I think is important here is to make sure that you define, kind of domains across the privacy area, as well as subdomains and control activities. We want to make sure here that we get the right balance, that we have a framework and that is both manageable, but also detailed enough that demonstrates accountability and maps into the underlying regulatory requirements. If we go to the next slide, once we, determine what the framework and baseline will be for our approach, we want to start actually mapping the controls into that. So we'll need to, this is where, a lot of the customization of these frameworks will begin. Companies may determine that they want to use NIST because they already use NIST for information security, or ISO for the same reason. Whichever framework you have, there's ultimately going to need to be customization to make sure that you can get the regulatory applicability aligned. So first and foremost, making sure that you understand all the regulatory requirements and working to map those against, the underlying controls in the framework. This will also require, you to go in and begin to customize that control language, develop, what are the testing procedures, what are the risks, and what are opportunities to mitigate those risks. Here as we go through, we also want to understand, what the controls, what data the controls align to, what type of data subjects are those for your consumers, or these are employee data subjects. That'll be critical as you're working to operationalize, test, and measure risk. As we look across, the various regulatory frameworks, there certainly is significant overlap in the requirements, but by using a one-to-many approach, you can, kind of map these the regulations into the control framework and have a more simplistic set of activities to manage. The overall goal here is really to develop a framework that has a clearly defined set of controls, and that as a collective, can address all of the organization's privacy obligations. Let's go to the next slide. Once we identify all the controls that need to be occurring, we need to make sure that we map, responsibilities, to those controls. So first and foremost here, we want to make sure that we, have ownership and identified. Some of these controls may sit with the privacy team, but many of the activities will actually be performed, around the business. Ownerships of these ownership needs to be defined so that those business owners understand their role. These kind of activities also help in promoting privacy by design concepts and making sure that individuals understand, what their responsibility is as it relates to privacy. And at this point in the process, I'd say it's also important to highlight, the importance of strong executive sponsorship, in order to make sure that your program has the backbone and the attention of stakeholders that may not, be sure how much, effort they should put into this and what the importance of this program will be. making sure that you have, that sponsorship, at the executive level, and that the management is pushing that down is critical. I think one thing we've seen here in practice is that it's not only the executive sponsorship, but it's also the middle management sponsorship. And how can you work to build, that consensus and a sense of ownership, within those organizations. For many, this is the most difficult part of the process. By engaging directly with the business, you're documenting how the controls have been implemented and really supporting them in communicating responsibility. I think that this is one of those activities that's much easier said than done and takes quite a bit of hand-holding and work to actually embed these activities within the underlying organizations. If we move to the next slide, once we, kind of identify what's happening and what is in place today, we want to start thinking to the future. And to do that, we want to make sure that we understand risks so that we can appropriately work to mitigate risks going forward. So as we look at this and we look at the controls and activities, we want to make sure we're thinking about, what are the high risk functions? Where are those heavy? I think that as, privacy professionals, we have a good understanding of what those high risk functions are, but it's important that we also make sure that the business understands that those are high risk functions. Those are high risk data collection activities. We want to make sure, that we assign a risk level with each underlying control. That'll also help feed reporting, escalation, and determine remediation efforts that are needed. As we look at the risks, they can also provide you insights into privacy operations. We also want to think about, what are the regulators looking for you to have? What are they looking for you to have in place? What enforcement actions could be evaluated against your program? If you have your right controls documented, that helps you address and shift priorities very quickly. And also, as we look at what are the processes or issues that are impacting risk or creating risks, as we look at the risk of noncompliance, with specific controls, the privacy team will need to look quickly to see how can we mitigate those risks and how can we effectively remediate those activities. Let's move forward to the next slide. So the last step in developing a really robust controls framework is to support risk mitigation, which is also a key outcome of designing and implementing this framework. Supporting risk mitigation involves monitoring control implementation, performing ongoing assessments and reviews, as well as using some of those KRIs to help monitor and measure privacy operations. By defining the controls and identifying all the control owners, the privacy team can be more ready to collaborate and support the business and risk mitigation activities. Once a risk is identified, the control owner can speak to the cause, whether it's a system issue, a resource constraint, a comprehension issue, or cost concern. And from there, the privacy team can work to, understand that risk, develop a plan, and support, any socialization that's needed to help leadership understand why we need to remediate these issues or to determine that the business is comfortable accepting the risk. I think that the privacy team can really leverage the risk mitigation opportunities to provide guidance and support, as well as to call out deficiencies based on metrics that can provide the business with, the tools that they need to really reduce that risk. A privacy compliance framework will also help really build a stronger understanding of the organization's, overall privacy obligations and, define that accountability to operationalize these activities. The business owner, coming out of these should be able to easily identify any privacy red flags and to know where they go for guidance when any of those red flags should be reported. I think that these activities really support your overall awareness and help constitute the risk. That means the risks can be more quickly identified and hopefully reduced and mitigated wherever possible. I think from there, so as we look in practice, at how companies have worked to implement these types of programs. Here, for example, is a case with a client where we worked through helping them to implement a privacy control framework, leveraging an existing industry framework. This company had privacy operations that were owned and managed outside of the privacy team and by business units across the organizations. They're a very global company. And, we had, as a result of that, over 15 regulations that they had to comply with relating to privacy. So to help the company meet their obligations, we needed a comprehensive way to help them assess their privacy compliance across a wide range of applicable laws. And then to help them identify and remediate gaps and develop a sustainable process to manage and maintain compliance. And this is really where having that rationalized framework that maps controls to each of the applicable regulations comes into play, and as well as incorporating some of those internal self-assessment activities and leveraging the KRIs to really monitor trends and provide direction to the company's leadership. In one of the challenges that we faced in helping this client establish a framework was identifying control owners. As I mentioned, this can often be one of the most challenging activities here. Early on, we recognized that individuals identified as control owners were not operationally responsible, and therefore had to coordinate with different business and IT teams, to really refine the process. But as we work to really identify who is performing these activities and who really owns these controls, we got those at the right level, and that really helped to embed the requirements in a much more meaningful way across the enterprise and laid a foundation to really have a sustainable and measurable program. With the implemented control activities and owners identified, we were able then to implement a recurring process such that the control owners went in every quarter and validated that they were still performing those activities, noted any changes to the process, and was able to leverage this framework as a mechanism to support audit committee and board reporting. If we move to the next slide. So as we look at compliance monitoring, this will help, support, the overall oversight of privacy operations, and really, will help maintain that compliance. The compliance monitoring activities, not only, help establish and help you make sure that the obligations are continuing to be in place and aligned, but it also creates an opportunities to help guide control owners and give extra attention to those areas where there is increased risk or remediation or mitigation activities that are in place. It's also good to make sure that from a compliance monitoring perspective that we define goals from a KRI perspective. We want to make sure that people understand, what does good look like? What are we looking to get to? And what is going to trigger, kind of some higher risk assessment or escalation activities? Certainly we'll want to make sure that, as high risk activities are identified, that they're getting to the right people, that the right data protection impact assessments, et cetera, are conducted and triggered. This compliance monitoring program also gives, more opportunities for the DPOs and other privacy leaders to have greater visibility into the ongoing activities within the program. Privacy programs are dynamic, they're changing as the business changes, and without these kinds of ongoing monitoring activities, it's impossible to stay on top of what's happening. To move forward to the next slide. So as you look to incorporate new regulations into the program, the privacy framework is a great help there as well. It gives you the opportunity to quickly map in a new regulation and understand, where you may have some of those gaps. As we look at the ever expanding, regulatory landscape here, this is critical and gives the privacy teams the ability to be more agile and adapt more quickly to whatever the next, regime determines the applicable controls to be. We did have a question come, and I thought I could address it, real time since we're here. But we had a question come in and said, can you talk about how the second line can provide good, actionable guidance to the business units on how to quantify their inherent privacy risks when some of the concepts in privacy by nature are so complex and nuanced? For example, cross-border transfers of personal data. Great question, and I think this is an ongoing challenge, for teams. Privacy is a complex space, so how do we make it real? I think what we have, seen work really well is, customized guidance by business unit. So really working to develop that guidance at the business unit level and not guidance that's at the enterprise level. If we can get in and understand, what those teams are doing, what some of their common use cases are, that's been successful. I've also seen some great examples of, just, picking one point and hitting it home, over and over and over again. For example, I had a client that was delivering some training and wanted to make sure that the business and sales teams understood that as they were taking pictures of products that they were, as they were, out in the field, that they needed to make sure that they weren't taking any pictures of any, other individuals or other types of personal information, within those photographs. And so they did a campaign, specifically related to that and sent out a series of guidance, through, different types of communication channels, focusing on, make sure that as you're taking these photos of our products out in the field, that sales teams aren't collecting any other, personal information, this is, critical, blah, blah, blah. But hitting that point home over and over again through email communications, through live trainings, through, individual, business unit meetings, they're able to kind of push those and then, move to the next concept. I think, trying to work, concept by concept has worked well for some. I don't know, Eric, if there's anything else you would add.
The only other thing I can think of is, and again, cross-border data transfer is a great example because I think that area is a little bit more complex, and that's really where you need to take your focus and make sure that you identify the right individuals. I know Lindsay just mentioned large campaigns, and that might not be right for cross-border transfers. Maybe you have very, very targeted campaigns to specific individuals to really narrow the focus and make sure that that specific group understands. And then again, customized, there might be a lot more hand-holding for something like cross-border data transfers at the beginning with the privacy team as compared to just data subject requests where you provide input and say, this is the process you need to follow, a lot more explainable, easy to do. So I think it all comes down to customizing what's best for that particular team. Using those use case examples, Lindsay, as you mentioned, has been always very helpful. And then just, again, hitting it home, just repeat, training, and making sure that they get used to that control function and how it should operate.
All right, Eric, I think I'll pass it back over to you.
Perfect. All right, so in addition to supporting that compliance monitoring, the other aspect that we want to take into account is looking towards automating some of those privacy assurance functions. So as we work to that point, I want to focus on evaluating kind of your program maturity and identifying those areas of improvement and where additional investment might be needed. So we've depicted a maturity model here, and it's broken down into 5 states. First, we have the initial state, which is where the program is more unpredictable, it's reactive, not really any policies or procedures existing, and most things are just being done ad hoc. Next, we have our defined state. This is where processes are more documented, but narrow. The operations are established in certain business units, but maybe not throughout the organization. And this is really where we're actually finding most organizations that have started working through privacy compliance, but a little unsure what to do at this point in time. Next, we see repeatable. Those processes become more established and proactive, and those operations are really more documented and pushed consistently throughout the organization. Our 4th state here is managed, which is where everything is really measured, controlled, and you got your compliance monitoring in place to evaluate effectiveness. And it's all happening on a recurring basis. And as you can see, that's really where privacy assurance is trying to bring you as part of that second line of defense function. And then lastly, we have optimized, and this is really just the very automated state. Everything is stable and flexible, and any of that continued process improvement is achieved through that automation. So as we look at the controls framework being established, a company can really use this maturity scale to identify where they might be located for overall key privacy domains and maybe some of those subdomains to identify areas that they're lagging in and benchmark themselves against their peers potentially. So I think a good example to provide is a data inventory. Maybe it was completed back in 2018 when GDPR first was requiring that to be done, and it really hasn't been reviewed since. It's no longer complete. It doesn't cover all the new business units or changes. And that's what we'd find really in the more defined state. It exists, but it doesn't really show the full picture. While conversely, you might have another process for data subject rights that has a full data workflow, documented controls, the guidelines are in place. You have a team that's fulfilling those requests at a monthly meeting to identify an uptake or downtake in trends of those responses and the timeliness, et cetera. So that's where you're looking at more of that mature state because they've started monitoring that on a month-by-month basis, and they're even using those KRIs to kind of identify those trends that involved. And of course, like everything, not all of these are going to be appropriate for a certain organization. So make sure you understand kind of what your risk appetite is. Some companies may not process a lot of personal data and may choose to just stay in that defined or repeatable state because they don't need to be more managed or optimized. So it's really understanding what your risk profile is and the customer demands and finding the sweet spot for your organization. And if you do want to go into that more managed and optimization, that's where I mentioned that automation is really going to be the key to get you into these two states. Otherwise, we've found that it's very difficult to manage from an efficiency and effectiveness standpoint. So as we look at kind of automation and supporting those efforts, a lot of times it's mostly used to eliminate those manual activities and the ability to facilitate tracking of KRIs and just sustaining those compliance monitoring activities. So all organizations need to be able to demonstrate that compliance. And I think that centralized tool also gives us a way to feel comfortable in an effective, efficient way to make sure that we have put these controls and operations in place, and it provides that visibility. They'll provide those workflows for data subject rights, as example, or they'll send notifications of expiring PIAs, requirements for data inventory revalidation, those certain things that are just much easier done an automated aspect than trying to track it manually via Excel or just remembering from an inbox request. So it's really just giving you easy access to those metrics as you look and build your privacy program. I think it also is going to support that scalability aspect. As we've mentioned, there's more and more privacy regulations that are coming forward. There's more geographies and lines of business that might be needing privacy assistance. So I think a technology would help the program by pushing some of those requirements and collecting feedback from that first line of defense as the program continues to grow. And it'll kind of provide an impact assessment on the business overall. And then finally, I think the last aspect are just the detailed reporting and tracking of the KRIs. Mentioned it a few times, but just having those metrics readily available through dashboards that you can copy and paste into PowerPoints for that executive group to look at. So not only do they feel comfortable with what's going on, but it's not taking you hours to create these reports. And without metrics, it's kind of difficult to hold those teams or the individuals accountable for all of the controls that they're taking care of throughout the organization. So as we look to summarize a lot of what goes into privacy assurance, we can see that there is multiple benefits. In addition to supporting those first line operation teams, the internal audit functions, it's really providing a general privacy framework to support visibility into compliance and risk management and establishing those roles and responsibilities. Through that defined governance structure, the framework, the monitoring, it's going to provide that visibility throughout the organization. And it'll also help the company understand areas of risk. It'll evaluate those trends. It will reduce the risk of non-compliance, and really building that cross-functional collaboration between the business owners, privacy, and internal audit. We've mentioned again and again that it establishes those clear roles and responsibilities, and it really provides the opportunity for privacy to become part of a value-added advisor to the business, and giving them the autonomy to establish those practices and support objectives while meeting all of the necessary compliance requirements. And then lastly, again, just ultimately helping the company strengthen their operations and risk mitigation activities. Ongoing compliance monitoring, evaluations, all of these kind of have an end goal of making sure that you meet your risk appetite for the organization. So as the final kind of question is where do we go from here, and what might your next steps be? First and foremost, just understand or revisit your regulatory and compliance needs. The first step you need to do is just understand and outline the responsibilities under the regulations that affect your organization. Next is going to be identifying those program improvements. This is really why you want to embed privacy insurance. It helps identify those gaps, helps improve the overall program, and that can be done through performing a simple end-to-end gap assessment, and just looking at all the privacy domains and then performing some self-assessment tests to identify those areas. Once the privacy assurance is embedded, work to just continually improve those controls and operationalize those monitoring activities. With the controls and monitoring in place, you really have already started effectively reducing risk. We mentioned that there always will be inherent risk, but the goal here is to make sure that you reduce risk to meet your specific appetite. And then finally, just prepare for an audit. That is separate from the self-assessments that the privacy and business owners would be performing on their own. But once the assurance program is set up and running, it gives you the equipment to support any independence audits from regulators or from the internal audit team, and providing them with the controls framework to do so. And with that, Lindsay, I'll send it back to you if there's any questions or final comments that you want to provide, and give a little bit of information about our team in general.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. First and foremost, if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to enter those in the chat and we can respond to those. I'll give you a few minutes to add some into there and tell you a little bit about our team at Grant Thornton. We have about 34 people that focus in the privacy and data protection space. We feel that we have a unique team. We're a team of, folks that are risk consultants, data protection SMEs, and privacy attorneys. We've done projects across the various regulatory regimes and really pride ourselves on, our, ability to help support the implementation and operationalizing these requirements and helping to automate those. We really support the wire wheel platform and, believe in that tool to help, build out these kinds of activities and functions. Any questions from the group that we can address? I know one common question we get in this space is, what is the right framework, for us to, use to leverage to begin to build the custom approach? I think here, what we've seen is we begin to see companies adopting the NIST framework and leveraging that. The companies that are using NIST are typically those that are using NIST from a security program perspective as well. It does provide, a nice baseline, especially to support board reporting and things like that. Obviously, if you're leaning towards ISO and use ISO, that's another reason to use that as well. I think we're seeing a lot of the more global organizations and service providers, leaning towards the ISO framework. I think, something to keep in mind is that all these frameworks are new. They haven't been around as long as a lot of their information security counterparts. And so as we look to make sure that, we'll need to make sure that we're really customizing the controls that apply to each organization and based on the various regulatory requirements that are applicable.
Lindsay, I wanted to make sure that you and Eric saw a couple of questions that I saw in the Q&A. I will read one, I'll read them so that you don't have to read them and think about it at the same time. Okay, here's one. Please share practical challenges and opportunities for effective integration of existing risk management and audit groups and activities when a company has chosen to create an independent privacy organization. And then there's kind of a follow-up to it, which is likewise for the data governance cross-functional organization.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't see those there, so I appreciate you keying us into those. I think as you're looking to integrate, with the existing, risk management and audit groups, you want to make sure that, one, let's leverage whatever platform they're using. How can we, make sure that our control framework exists within, their, risk management framework. I think what's important as well is to develop those integrations between your privacy technology and the risk management tools to make sure that they're, kind of seamless, that you're continuously updating, and that there is truly one source of the truth.
And I would add to that too. I think this is a good opportunity for teams to kind of create what we call more or less privacy champion groups. So there should be kind of this overarching steering committee, if possible, based on your organizational size, that can really be the leadership behind all of the privacy activities. And that group should be made up of individuals from risk management, from data governance, from potentially internal audit, like all these people kind of working together on that kind of more committee role to push down different roles and responsibilities or things that are going on within the program, not just to privacy, but to their own groups separately as well. And as well, then you're looking at the entire organization kind of being part of that privacy champion program. So again, that's choosing maybe someone from risk management to be a second level leadership, and data governance having second level leadership that kind of then works with that main committee to kind of push it out to all of their kind of under staff individuals, things like that. So it's really kind of just spreading privacy organically throughout the organization, all stemming from that original privacy committee and then some of those other individuals that are involved.
We have two other questions. I'm going to be biased because one of them mentions marketing, and I'm going to put it up next, but other anonymous attendee who asked you a very good question, and we'll hopefully get to that one too. This question is, the back and forth with the marketing department can be somewhat painful. E.g., what is a controller? Have you seen approaches that help?
Yeah, I think, to a certain extent, time, heals all wounds. And I think, over time, everybody will learn more about, what is a controller, what's a processor, and what are those distinctions. In the meantime, I'll go back to some of the guidance that we gave earlier. I think, really developing that, customized, activities and guidance and training, awareness communications for each department, and targeting specific issues one at a time, I think can be helpful in really helping to build that understanding. Some of the things that we've seen as well is, building out, really user-friendly processes to gather information, to engage with privacy, some of the softer activities, even just, being responsive, always, having a, 24-hour, response window for everybody to make sure that they understand you're going to get back to them quickly. Those kinds of activities are really important, and I do think build that organizational kind of willingness to adopt some of these privacy requirements and additional activities. But it does take time. I think that's where, going back as well to what Eric mentioned around the privacy champion program and trying to build some of those liaisons and really, defining responsibilities for privacy within marketing. There are first line responsibilities there. It's privacy is a second line function. Some of this can also, I think, help them build a more sense of ownership of some of these requirements.
I am very resonant with what you're saying. And as a marketing person, I want to say to those people who are not in the department, this is the vanguard of that thinking. And we have an opportunity to actually actualize.
Yeah.
Here is the next and possibly last question. Oh, no, there are too many in this chat. It's great. Okay, here's the next chat one I promised. Have you seen customers starting internal privacy audits or external audits? Then I have another
Yes.
one.
Yeah.
I think both. I think, here we have seen, I'll say, maybe I'll talk about these in kind of the second line and third line terms. So we are seeing, the second line performing some validation of their controls and making sure that those are happening. We are also seeing internal audit coming behind and, completing those. I think the external audits certainly, we are seeing, those being outsourced, and regulators, are coming as part of their investigations, to perform reviews. But they have not, yet I think achieved, the rigor of some of the internal audits that we see in other areas. I think one of the challenges that a lot of the teams are facing is that the internal audit teams don't know privacy and don't know how to audit without really having that control framework established. And so,
Mhm.
by creating, some of these frameworks and, kind of activities, we're helping, the internal audit team, better, focus their activities, use less time of the second line and the first line teams in trying to understand what's happening and, being able to give them a baseline to start and then, continue their recurring auditing process.
I personally am finding this notion of first line, second line, third line very helpful as a principal. Here's perhaps our last question, but feel free, we still have a few minutes. We have found the need to edit our templates regularly. Are you seeing this with others?
I think that this needs to be something that people are, continuously, reviewing and, continuously evolving. A lot of, I think the second line's responsibility is creating a really seamless user experience for the, first line users. And, part of that is making sure that the template is very easy to understand, that the answers, in the choices, the way that they're able to respond, that those align to whatever the various, new regulatory requirements are, that you're also, changing and adapting to whatever, new business ventures you may be getting into. I also think it's important to continue to update those and to provide links into some of the guidance documents and materials that you have so that, those users can go in and make sure that they understand, kind of how to respond to these questions, make it as easy as possible. But unfortunately, we have seen a lot of updates to those templates, hopefully over time, some of that as the, regulatory environment, kind of slows down a bit, we'll see some of that slow down as well. But I do think that does help, staying on top of those, really does promote that end user experience.
And one piece I can add there, just to add some color and hopefully some helpful information, is really try to limit the amount of free text fields when you're creating these templates, because that's where you're going to get individuals that may not have as much knowledge as you were hoping, and you get either long-winded answers that don't provide you what you need or short answers that don't provide. So make it as templated and fixed answers as possible with drop downs or very specific choices rather than free text, because at that point you're just asking to have to go back and forth multiple times to try to understand what they're saying or what they're trying to get passed out along to you. So avoid those free text fields where possible.
Okay, well, there's kind of a related question, and then there's yet another question after that. Here's this one. How do you work with tools to customize a program? Are there learnings you have from that, which perhaps is what you just shared, Eric? What are critical feature requirements?
Yeah, definitely. I think automation is critical to maintaining a privacy assurance program, to maintaining a privacy program, to building that end user and that business user buy-in, making that as seamless as possible certainly is critical. I think, what we're seeing is that the ability to really, kind of customize, those activities and develop something that makes sense and that speaks the language of the business users is really important. I think, there's a lot of the features are great. There's a lot of opportunities to really streamline, the activities, but I think, critical, making sure that you have, APIs that can connect, your enterprise IT systems, in with your privacy tools, in with your risk tools, make sure that everybody is seeing the same information, that the information's only being entered in one time. That helps support, so many of the downstream activities. I think what we've seen be really successful is, honestly working through a pilot approach and working, first, let's work with one business unit. Let's walk through the process, the template. Let's customize it. Let's refine it. And then let's go to the next group. Let's work with that group again, continue to refine. And that, kind of idea of continuous improvement, I think, ends up supporting the most successful programs.
Okay, so just so we can say we got to all the questions, here's one last one, although I think it's big, but you'll get about 30 seconds to answer it. Can you talk about how the second line can provide good actionable guidance to the business unit on how to quantify their inherent privacy risks when some of the concepts in privacy are by nature so complex and nuanced? One example, cross-border transfers of personal data.
Yeah, I think we did address this one actually during the presentation, because I did see this one in the other chat. But here, kind of where we, I think what we talked about before, it's really some of the same, things that we're hammering home. I think, one, making sure that people, through their control environment, understand what they are responsible for as it relates to privacy. They're responsible for telling you when there is, a data transfer that's going to another location. They're not responsible for analyzing, what the legal requirements are, but they need to know that they need to raise their hand. They're responsible for, putting requirements into the product that allow you to, support access requests and things like that. But we're not asking them to be the legal person to make these decisions. I think providing, that, specific guidance, customized guidance, continuing to hammer home the concepts, one by one, time helps. And I think, over the next year or 2 years, we'll see our business units really starting to take more ownership of some of these privacy activities, which is really the goal.
So thank you. Thank you for reinforcing. And Eric, thank you. Lindsay, thank you. We're right at time. I think I'm going to have the opportunity to tell you about our next panel or two here, which I hope that our audience can join us on. Our next panel is knowledge creation and data protection, how an enterprise data strategy enables both. And this will feature Joanne Stonier of MasterCard. She's the Chief Data Officer there. And well-known thought leaders, Martin, or AKA Marty Abrams, and Barbara Lawler. Following that session, we have closing remarks where you may not already know, but we have wonderful people joining us in addition to Justin to talk about predictions for 2022. And those people include Jocelyn Aqua of PwC, Andy Dale of Alice, Stacey Gray of the Future of Privacy Forum, and Omer Taune from Goodwood. So see you right now at the next session and hopefully the one after too. Thank you.